Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Connect Plus webinar as we discuss how to design loan products that advance racial justice. I'm Cindy Lakshanan, SVP of Development Services at OFN, and I'm going to kick us off with some housekeeping tips and an overview of our agenda. In terms of housekeeping, a note that we are recording this webinar. The recording will be available within the next week on CDFI Connect and our YouTube channel. We also encourage you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves, share comments, and interact with other participants. So we've allotted 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for audience questions. With that said, please feel free to submit any questions you have in the Zoom Q&A box as they occur to you. And in terms of our agenda, we're going to start with an overview of our new Operationalizing Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility into Lending Practices toolkit. We'll then dive deeper into the leading practices highlighted in the toolkit through a panel discussion and end with Q&A. Next slide, please. On the next slide. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsor. This webinar and the toolkit were developed with support from the Citi Foundation. The next slide, please. As part of our Next Generation CDFI Workforce Initiative, which aims to strengthen the recruitment and development of careers in community development finance, as well as facilitate access to the tools, skills, and expertise CDFIs need. Through this initiative, we're building tailored professional development resources and opportunities for CDFI practitioners, such as new in-person and virtual trainings, as well as a career center. We'll also be producing over 30 toolkits over the next couple of years to share leading practices on a variety of topics. Next slide, please. Our newest toolkit is focused on operationalizing racial equity, inclusion, and accessibility into lending practices. As we've thought about which toolkits to develop first, we've been very focused on meeting the needs of our members and working in partnership with all of you to develop our content. So this toolkit was developed in response to the strong interest we heard in understanding what it really takes to operationalize racial equity and inclusion into lending practices. CDFIs are rooted in the civil rights, worker rights, and social justice movements. And we have a track record of moving capital to places where traditional markets won't go. However, the fight for economic and racial justice is far from over, and there's still room to improve. We have to understand the ways in which our policies, practices, and products may unintentionally uphold systemic racism and be willing to interrogate our work to ensure we're not recreating or perpetuating the barriers we're seeking to break down. Our new toolkit provides you with the insights, tools, and suggestions to assist you in doing just that, to incorporate an explicit focus on racial equity, inclusion, and accessibility into your lending practices. Next slide. So you can access the toolkit via the link noted here on the slide, and if you're joining us live, we'll be sharing a link to the toolkit in the chat. You can access and download all of our leading practices, resources, and toolkits as they get added on CDFI Connect. Once you log into CDFI Connect, navigate to the resources drop-down menu, select OFN resources, and then find the OFN leading practices resources folder on the left side of the page. You'll see the other resources we released last quarter, such as our CDFI 101 toolkit and talent recruitment resource on how to write effective job descriptions. If you don't have a CDFI Connect account, you can join for free at the link noted on the slide, which we'll include in the chat as well. And then next slide. So what's in the toolkit? The reality is that dismantling decades of structural inequality and systemic racism takes time. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for how to do this work. So this toolkit is structured to provide guidance around leading practices, resources, and activities that can help you and your CDFI take action in the unique context of your organization and community. The next slide. So the primary component of the toolkit is a guide structured in 4 sections, each with suggested actions and activities you can undertake individually or as a group. It starts with a focus on power. It explains why it's critical to understand systemic racism through the lens of power. When we talk about systemic racism, we're essentially talking about the ways in which power is used to create and maintain systems that embed privileges associated with whiteness while discriminating against and oppressing people of color. And as a result, in order to create enduring change, we have to understand and shift power. This section and its accompanying resource share definitions and include frameworks and tools to analyze and reflect on power, whether individually or in the context of your institution. Next slide. The second section contains suggested actions individual practitioners can take. To develop a stronger understanding of systemic power and racism, we have to first commit to interrogating and educating ourselves on an ongoing basis. This can start with re-examining the conversations you have every day and the power dynamics of your working relationships. The toolkit provides you on guidance with where to begin, such as learning from history and recognizing, understanding, and addressing unconscious biases. Next slide. Racism isn't just an individual problem requiring an individual intervention, but a structural and organizational problem that requires hard work, time, and intentionality to change. So while the individual actions shared in the toolkit are necessary, the various forms of systemic racism make it hard for individuals to create enduring change if the organizations and systems they operate in don't transform alongside them. So this section includes ways in which CDFIs, and in particular their executive leadership, can be more intentional about ensuring their organizations move capital in a way that achieves greater racial justice and equality. This includes considering alternative definitions of creditworthiness, implementing ongoing education and training for your team, examining how you communicate, engaging in active listening, working in solidarity with community, and much more that we'll cover today during today's webinar. And next slide. Last but not least, the toolkit includes a section on how to incorporate accessibility into your lending practices. Many CDFIs are already serving people with disabilities, whether they realize it or not. But without an intention to serve this market, CDFIs may be limiting the positive impact they could have on this underserved population. So this section shares strategies, suggestions, and resources to help your CDFI create intentionality around how to better support people with disabilities. So the toolkit is member and peer reviewed, as the people who know this work best are the people who do it every day. And we want to ensure our toolkits reflect leading practices that are actionable, relevant, and can be adapted to the needs of your organization and community. And so that to that end, you'll find examples and resources from our member CDFIs within the toolkit. And I'm really excited to welcome 3 of the practitioners and organizations who contributed to our toolkit for our panel today as we dive deeper into what actions institutions can take to design products that advance racial justice. So joining us, we have Elisa Frazier, the Director of Racial Equity and Impact Lending at LIFT, the Low Income Investment Fund, Jen Trapinski, the Director of Loan Originations at CSH, and Corporation for Supportive Housing, and Bob Porter, the Managing Director of Business Lending at PCV, Pacific Community Ventures. So to get us started, can you tell us what catalyzed your CDFI's journey to operationalize racial equity into its lending practices? And Elisa, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for having me here. It's great to be here. At LIFT, like many other CDFIs, we've been in the business of poverty alleviation through our community development lending for many decades. And we recognized over the last several years that focusing on low-income communities and using that income as a proxy for race was really something we needed to overcome if we were going to make an impact in the communities that we work in. Primarily, our dollars are deployed in communities of color, and elevating that recognition that racial inequity and the need to advance racial justice has to be a key part of how we deploy our capital was something that we crystallized about 4 years ago and then put out in our strategic plan in 2020. At LIFT, our greatest engine for impact is our lending. We have tremendous amount of power as a financial intermediary, deploying $250 million in loans every year. And so how we make lending decisions, the methods, the practices, the policies, the tools, all of that is critically important to do with a racial equity perspective, because that is how we're going to make a difference in advancing racial equity with our lending business. And so over the last couple of years, we've been developing those tools and practices and methods that I'm excited to share more about here today.
Thanks, Elisa. And Jen, we'll go to you next.
Great, thanks, Cindy, and thanks again for having us on hosting this webinar and having us on. So CSH started our equity journey looking back around 2017. We realize that the Corporation for Supportive Housing focuses on supporting, using housing as a platform for services for the most vulnerable in our communities. Looking at the different populations that supportive housing serves, there is a disproportionate amount of BIPOC individuals in all of the systems that we touch, be it the homelessness system, the justice system, the healthcare systems. All of these systems have a disproportionate representation of BIPOC individuals. And so our conversation as an organization started in 2017 around how do we address equity and race equity in the work that we do as an organization. And our 2018 strategic plan was incorporating equity at that time. In 2019 was really when the work started, when we hired C4 Innovation to do a race equity survey for the organization. We created a position for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging director to help lead our work as an organization. And in that year, we also, the director of DEIB created a race equity design and implementation team to help the entire organization, have representation from the different teams across our organization to help drive this work forward. And out of what we call Reddit, the Race Equity Design and Implementation team, we formulated a race equity framework for the organization. And so that race equity framework helped us as an organization create a really comprehensive framework for how we're addressing race equity in all of our lines of business, including community investment. So our community investment team, which includes our lending activity and our new markets tax credit activity, we have this framework that really helped to launch this work internally for us on the lending side.
Thanks, Jen. And then Bob.
Hi, thanks, Sandu. Thanks for including PCV in this conversation. So Pacific Community Ventures, better known as PCV by most folks, has deep roots in the early impact investing movement. Over the past 25 years, we've broadened our approach. And in late 2019, shortly after joining us, our new CEO, Bobal Gupta, she stated both internally and externally that PCV would be an anti-racist organization. And she's continued to speak about that. Although we'd done some work prior to her coming on board to operationalize racial equity, her, as new CEO, catalyzed the entire organization to continually improve racial equity components in all of our programs and within the organization as a whole. Today, PCV is engaged in field building research, product strategy, all to support impact-first investment in small businesses led by entrepreneurs of color and women, with an eye toward equitable access to wealth building opportunities. At the center of our strategy is our new restorative capital model, where we're working to provide capital at lower rates and lower fees than ever before.
And so what I really remember hearing from all of you, right, is that your organization's made up a wholesale commitment to racial equity and becoming an anti-racist CDFI. But then the next level, right, you're all directors of lending. So the next step is how do you operationalize this into your lending practices? How do you change how the money gets out? So can you tell us about how you went about examining your lending practices, your policies, and your processes? And can you share some specific examples of the changes that you made as a result? And then Jen, we'll start with you.
Great. Yeah. Examining our policies, processes, and procedures is an ongoing process. We are definitely not finished with it. But I would say that, the process of creating our race equity framework, it took about a year, starting in 2019. By the end of 2020, we had this framework to help guide our lending and investment. And so in terms of, that's the first step to start stating the goals. So I'll walk you through the overall goal and then a couple of examples of changes that we've made and that we're in the process of making. Our overall goal for our community investment framework is to eliminate bias in our lending and investment products, practices, relationships, and portfolio in order to achieve a balanced portfolio and provide equitable financial opportunities to BIPOC organizations. That process took a year between the race equity design implementation team, communicating with the community investment team back and forth to really establish the overall goals and underlying objectives. So the first objective that I'll touch on is incorporating the race equity framework into our lending, underwriting, and decision-making. And so one of the low-hanging fruit there in terms of our strategies was to incorporate a race equity lens into our decision-making around our lending and investment. So what we did was we changed our credit policy to add a member to our internal credit policy, our internal credit committee that is it's a 1-year rotating membership on the internal credit committee. And that person has to have served on the race equity design and implementation team. So it's an intentionality around bringing a race equity lens with that position to really show that in our credit policies and in our meetings every week. While that's not that individual's sole responsibility to be the race equity, to bring race equity to our lending, it provides that intentionality around our structure. And then the second objective that I wanted to address was eliminating bias and increasing diverse representation by examining the policies and practices that govern our lending operations. And so the main strategy that we utilized here was to hire a consultant to examine all of our internal lending and investing documents, including our credit manual, our procedures manual, our loan application, our website, all of those different elements to provide recommendations for creating greater, making our policies and procedures more equitable. We hired the Center for Urban and Racial Equity to do this document review, and they came up with 77 discrete recommendations to make changes to our documents. So we've been spending the last year or so trying to figure out how to prioritize, how to set up an infrastructure that's really inclusive, that gets all of our team bought into what these changes are, how do we advance this? And so right now we're in the implementation phase of moving those forward.
Wow, that's incredible. And Bob, we'll go to you next.
My head's still spinning on the 77 recommendations. At PCV, we started by looking at our lending portfolio at the time. We looked at our pipeline, we looked at our processes, we looked at underwriting. At that same point, we were part of the Wells Fargo DCC cohort. So we were taking learnings and best practices from that and adding to the conversations we were having internally. Analyzed what our average loan in our portfolio looked like from an underwriting standpoint. And did that look like something that was meeting our mission or not? And then we looked at, in our processes, where were applicants falling out? Where were they stumbling? Where were we losing them? All of that led to various changes and improvements. Some of those examples were, one of the first changes we made was we eliminated the need for collateral. PCV is no longer a collateral-based lender. Many of our borrowers, they rent, they take public transportation because they live in major metropolitan areas of California. So we're not a collateral-based lender. Then we eliminated the need for projections and a balance sheet. It just didn't fit the kind of lending that we were wanting to do, and the balance sheet wasn't needed because we no longer were looking at collateral. Our next change, which really helped, was eliminating the personal financial statement and all of the underwriting that was associated with that. Again, because we had so many of our applicants that were renting, they bootstrapped their businesses, and therefore our personal net worth was still being built at that point. So eliminating that was huge to our program. We eliminated minimum credit score over time and moved to a more streamlined internal loan approval process, so that we could be more responsive, make decisions faster. Now we try to make a decision same day if possible. And finally, and probably equally important, was we made sure that our application process was mobile friendly, so that all of our processes, including the closing process, could be done using a mobile device. Internally, this required bringing in some new software and new versions of most of our existing documentation.
Yeah, and Bob and Jen, like what you're both talking about is how you looked at kind of the process itself, right, from start to finish, and kind of like trying to make it more inclusive, but also just like redefining creditworthiness, like how you kind of perceive risk and what the actual risk is. And like, Elisa, can you tell us more about kind of how LIF has approached this?
Yeah, at LIF, we really have been focusing on that moment of decision making about how capital is allocated, when capital is allocated, how much is allocated, and where it goes. At LIF, we've been working on what we call the IRP framework, Impact, Risk, Profitability Framework. And this is a framework that it has 3 tools: an impact scorecard, a risk rating model, and a profitability model that is going to allow us to place an impact value, a risk rating, and a profitability value on every loan in our portfolio, every loan that comes through that we look at, that we think about making decisions on lending on, with the theory that if we know these 3 values, we can make better decisions about when we can pull that risk lever, when we can pull that profit lever in the service of impact. And when we talk about impact, one of the key pieces here has been defining impact from a racial equity perspective. What do we actually mean when we say racial equity? We are a real estate lender. We finance developers building affordable housing, building schools. We finance healthcare centers, early care and education. What does racial equity actually look like? And what is the difference maker from one deal to the next? The way we articulate that is by thinking about opportunities, projects, and borrowers that are increasing and preserving access to critical resources and opportunities, driving positive outcomes, and building power and agency for Black and Latino communities and other communities of color. And our impact scorecard allows us to essentially rank those opportunities and think about projects that are just increasing access, which is great. That is bread and butter of community development. What else are they doing? Are they also building outcomes? And even more, are they also increasing and building that power and agency for communities? And that's how we articulate racial equity in lending. That is shows up in our impact scorecard and is translated into an impact score and what we call a racial equity tier. And so we take that impact score and look at it alongside our risk rating and how much profit, financial sustainability are we going to derive from the lending opportunity, and can start saying things like, well, if this is super high impact, this is what we call a racial equity standout loan. What are we able to and willing to do from a risk perspective and from a profitability perspective, because we really want to get the capital out to this opportunity? We have just started implementing this framework in our live lending business, so in underwriting when deals are coming in. And we are also in the process of doing a look back at deals that closed over the last 3 fiscal years, so we can get a baseline and see where are we, where have our deals been in the last 3 years, and where do we want to do more business, where do we want to do less business, and ultimately those tools then that tool is the basis for kind of changing all of the practices around decision making. So how lenders develop business, who they develop business with, who do they call back first when they've got 5 people to call back, thinking about racial equity when they're making those kinds of soft capital allocation decisions before a deal even gets to term sheet. And then how do our approvers think about this? What does it look like to bring a deal into the portfolio that might not have traditionally past risk and profitability hurdles? Is there room for that? And how do we change the composition of the decision making, of the people at the decision making table, as well as then ultimately seek the right funding to match with these opportunities that we're seeing out there in the market?
Thank you for sharing. And it's like a lot of what you all have talked about, right, is like shifting of power too. Like we talk about kind of the toolkit and how it starts with understanding your power. Like lenders have power, right? Like we are gatekeepers. We talk about, like, we make decisions around who gets capital, like capital access. And the changes you're making and kind of the tools you're putting in place are like help like people reflect around like what's happening and where, or bringing people to the table and giving them power in decision making, right? Like Lisa, you were just talking about that. And so we talked about this yesterday a little bit in our prep call too, but a thing that all your organizations have done now that you kind of have like done this work around your processes and policies is that you've developed new loan products and programs as a result of that work you've done to operationalize racial equity. But the like practices and policies part of it really is like a precondition to having the products and having the impact you want it to make. And so can you tell us more about like your products and programs that you've developed as a result of the work you've done today, and like kind of the changes that you've made to your practices and policies that enabled you to really have the impact that you want with these products? Sorry, Bob, we'll start with you.
Okay. I see some notes in chat. So PCV is a California-based lender. We lend throughout California. We only do small business lending, so that's all that we do. And in terms of products that have come out of all the things that we've talked about today, one of the most discussed products is our open 0% loan fund. So PCV was able to raise 2.5 million in capital and additional grants to support programmatic expenses. And the idea was that we would deploy capital in 5 designated highest unemployment, lowest income neighborhoods in Oakland, California. One of the things that really made the program successful, the product successful, was that we worked with community organizations within those neighborhoods in advance. We did that so we could build trust, to understand how to market the fund, what other items were needed, like translation services, to be successful. PCV launched the fund in late 21, immediately was oversubscribed, had $10 million in applications in about 10 days. The great thing about the applications that were coming in were they fit what we wanted to see, they fit the neighborhood, they fit where we wanted to deploy. And I think all of that was due to building the trust in the neighborhoods, working with those community organizations, and having them be our conduit for really flowing applications and applicants to us. So we were able to quickly deploy $2.5 million at 0% with 0 fees to 33 BIPOC business owners. All the changes we made prior to launching this fund, and were discussed earlier, they made all of this so much easier, so much faster, and the underwriting, the approval, the funding happened so quickly because of everything we put in place beforehand. Now we plan as an organization to do more place-based lending. We're looking at other areas in California. 0% in this rate environment probably won't happen again, but we're trying to keep capital as low as possible and fees also as low as possible as we roll out these place-based funds.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I think I look at those stats, right? The fact that you were oversubscribed so quickly, I think talks to kind of like the impact that you can have when you do the work in a way that kind of really responds to community needs. Jen, can you tell us more about the CSH's initiatives and products?
Yeah, sure. So as a part of our race equity framework, building that out, part of what we wanted to do was increase our lending to BIPOC organizations. And so we reached out and did some listening sessions. And as a part of the feedback that we heard around the needs, loud and clear, the need for access to capital, and also what we are calling technical assistance, but mostly around supportive housing and developing quality supportive housing. Not every developer has developed supportive housing, has a real expertise around that. So we add technical assistance to that. And then third is around policy and systems change, and lowering the barriers to access where it comes to local and state housing finance sources. So we named our initiative Redesigning Access by Centering Equity. It's the RACE initiative for short. And we launched that in 2020. And we have 5 main goals as a part of the RACE initiative that I'll mention later. But I think that the main change that has helped us in this initiative is really setting goals around supporting emerging developers. We have both emerging and experienced BIPOC developers that we increase lending to. Typically, experience is a higher barrier to entry in the affordable housing development space. And our community investment officers on the ground might otherwise overlook or kind of pass by, with the gatekeeping power that they have, emerging developers who may not seem to have the traditional experience in developing affordable housing. And so setting those targets for lending and investing in emerging BIPOC developers has been, I think, maybe the most tangible result of our shift in focus, our setting goals on increasing our investment in these organizations and these communities. And what makes it successful is really having that commitment at the leadership level of the organization for us to be able to propose these changes, to take this time and to really incorporate the entire organization in this process.
Thanks for highlighting that, Jen. All right, like we talk about this in the toolkit too, like institutional actions are like important, but unless you have that buy-in from the executive kind of team, that it really doesn't kind of pull through the organization, you're not able to have the true impact that you can. And I think the other thing that we're hearing a lot right now from like all of your all's comments, is like the need for intentionality, right? Like I think that there's like, you can have good intentions, but like the impact kind of really depends on how you structure that intentionality and how you have accountability. And the stuff that you're talking about is like building that in. And like, Elisa, can you tell us more about like what you're doing at LIF?
Yeah, at LIF, so I talked about the IRP framework. We also have been working with a new product we call the Black Developer Capital Initiative. It's an unsecured pre-development line of credit specifically designed for for-profit affordable housing firms led by people who identify as Black or African American. And it is a product that really grew out of what we heard in our markets on the East Coast, hearing from developers who we define as experienced in affordable housing, and the lack of access to early stage capital specifically to get projects off the ground. As a developer, you wait for the next developer fee in order to work on the next project. And if you don't have access to generational wealth, as is very common in the Black community, you don't have the ability to accelerate that business, to continue to pursue different projects, have that visibility into the pipeline to grow your business. And so we really wanted to focus on that very specific moment in time in a business with our capital. We've done pre-development lending in the past. And so we took our existing pre-development product and really looked at how could we change this? How could we make this more accessible? How could we change the parameters so that our ultimate goal is to build the wealth and power and representation of Black developers in the affordable housing industry. And so that product, one of the main differences with that product is that we take what we would consider an experience first approach in underwriting. We do not emphasize personal wealth, personal financial statements as the key criteria for eligibility. We're really looking at the experience that someone brings to the table. We believe the best bet in terms of your ability to execute on this and for us to get repaid is your experience in getting a project done. And when we look at experience, we're not just looking at experience of the firm itself. We work with some developers in BDCI who have worked as consultants for 25 years, worked for somebody else as staff, and now they're going out on their own. We honor that experience. That experience is valuable to us. And so by bringing those folks into the pipeline, we've really seen how this access to this early stage capital can kind of take people at different levels of experience to the next level in their business. This is also a special purpose credit program for LIF, SPCP. So when we think about opportunities to name race and be intentional about race in your lending, take advantage of that SPCP designation. That is a way to sort of overcome any risk aversion when it comes to racial equity lending. Because like I say, you can't do racial equity unless you talk about race. So you got to put it in there.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think what I appreciate kind of like what you're saying, right, is that you brought it back to kind of how you've redefined creditworthiness, right, for all three of you, like the kind of pre-work of like redefining creditworthiness and who qualifies and who doesn't, or what it means to think about risk, really led to your ability to deploy these products and get it out to the people that you've been trying to serve more intentionally. And so like we've been talking a lot about like practices and policies and kind of like really kind of nuts and bolts kind of work, right? So like when we think about our communities, like CDFIs exist to serve the people, right? So like what has the impact been of like these products and making these changes both in your community and at your organization? Bob, we'll start with you.
Thanks. So what we're hearing from the communities that we lend in is that our organization is showing up and we're doing what we say. I can't say that we were always being perceived that way in the past, but because of our underwriting, because of the products we've been putting out, because of the capital we've been deploying, we're consistently hearing from community partners, neighborhood associations, et cetera, that we are showing up and doing what we say we're going to do. And that's a fantastic feeling as an organization. We've also seen a shift in funders. Previously we had a core group of CRA type capital, providing capital for the lending program. Because of our portfolio statistics and how we're deploying capital and where and to whom, we've expanded the type of capital providers we have. CRA type capital is a very small percentage of what we actually are able to attract now. We're getting a variety of different funders, from foundations to corporations, et cetera, that are interested in the work that we're doing. So that's been fantastic. But most importantly, from the community standpoint, at the end of 2018, PCV reported that we were 56% lending to entrepreneurs of color. So we just passed that 50% mark. We were 56. As of year end 2022, we increased that to 82% of our lending went to entrepreneurs of color. We're hoping to hit closer to 90% this year in 2023. So really showing up in communities and deploying capital, that's the big win at the end of the day.
Thanks for sharing. Jen?
Yeah, so the RACE initiative is 2 years old. So we haven't quite gotten to the stage where we're able to report back on outcomes from, we have outputs that we can report on, but the outcomes of building wealth for BIPOC developers and BIPOC communities is a part of the evaluation process that we'll have to integrate in terms of holding ourselves accountable to the ultimate outcomes that we're looking for. As I said before, we have five-year goals for the RACE initiative. The first is to invest $200 million over 5 years in BIPOC organizations. And after 2 years, we've closed $108 million. So we're well on our way to that $200 million target. The second is invest in and provide technical assistance to at least 75 developers over 5 years. And that includes 25 emerging developers. So at the end of 2 years, we've supported 30 BIPOC developers with our investments. And that includes 11 emerging developers over the past 2 years. Over time, as Bob said, looking at portfolio and percentage of investment in BIPOC organizations, we ran a baseline of the previous 5 years. I think it was from 2015 to 2020 or so, where our portfolio was 43% BIPOC organizations, and we set a target to increase that to 65% over 5 years. Our target, I actually don't have the data on what we did last year, but our target this year is to increase that to about 55% of our lending for the year to get us towards that 65%. And then lastly, we have a goal for influencing racial equity considerations in QAPs and other state funding. We have already engaged a consultant to do some analysis around QAPs and race equity work, and have more work to do in terms of the results of that and what to do about that initial study.
Thanks, Jen. And Elisa?
Yeah. So like Jen, our BDCI product, we're about 18 months, almost 2 years in, fully committed on the first 20 million. We are looking to deploy another 20 million this year, starting next month, which is very exciting. This is the kind of thing where real learnings are going to take some time. When we think about the impact of this product, we're thinking about it in two ways. Both, how is this impacting the community of developers who are accessing this loan product? And then how is this impacting and reflecting back on us as an organization? The way we really make a long-term change for racial equity is by changing how we do things across the board, not just for this individual project, so that as we're going along with this, we're kind of picking up learnings along the way. Some examples of that on the community impact side with the developers I mentioned with BDCI, we've got a range of experience for folks who are just going out on their own for the first time. This is the only option for pre-development financing that they're able to access. It's putting them in better positions to negotiate JV positions when they are partnering on development. It allows them to not only increase their liquidity for their projects, but then has this effect of increasing the liquidity of the vendors they work with. So the development consultant they work with, they're able to pay them more quickly, and that impacts their business. For developers who are on the higher end of experience, we're seeing how having this large line of credit available for pre-development gives them that visibility into the future and confidence in building pipeline of more projects going forward. We are going to be doing a formal evaluation of the program over the next 2 years, where we will get deeper on those learnings. We'll also be looking at the loan performance. How do these loans perform with our traditional pre-development product? What differences do we see? Are there any differences? What does that tell us about how we can bring some of the practices from BDCI into our overall portfolio? And we've also been just experimenting with different things with this product. I mentioned the way we look at experience, thinking about your experience as a consultant or as staff. We've developed a new template that helps us analyze that experience that is not of the firm, but of your prior experience elsewhere. That's really starting to make its way into credit memos and help us as decision makers really recognize the value of that experience that developers are bringing to the table. And we hope to apply that across the board in our lending.
Thank you. And I think what like really stands out to me hearing you all talk about the impact, right, is like how impactful you've already been. And like we talked about kind of at the beginning, right? Like this work takes time. Like, you know, dismantling kind of like decades of inequity takes time to do correctly, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't start, and it doesn't mean that you can't start having an impact, right? Like I think about what you all have said, and it's like, Bob, like you're kind of like double the percentage to like of loans to people of color, right? Like Jen and Lisa, you're like well on your way to hitting targets that are pretty, like you didn't like set like easy targets to hit, right? But you're kind of like achieving them. And I think it just like kind of like, I don't know, it inspires me at least, right? To be like, oh yeah, like people should definitely be doing this. And there's a path forward to it, right? And so I know that there's a lot of questions coming into the chat. So I'm going to skip right to kind of the last question that we have kind of prepared, which was like a lightning round. So like before we transition to Q&A, what's one call to action you have for the audience, right? Like your peers, the other CDFI leaders and practitioners listening in today. What do you want to leave them with? And Bob, we'll start with you.
Well, I didn't prep for this question. I didn't see it on the list. So I think, you know, start. And if you have started, recognize that you will never be done. We hit 82% last year. We want to hit 90 this year. So, you know, we have work to do to get there. So just the fact that we're never done in trying to make improvements and to reach more and more.
Thanks, Bob. Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that similar to Bob, like just start, get started. It feels like there's never the right time. Where do you start? You know, you can get in a cycle of analysis paralysis, and just start somewhere. If you're serious about increasing access to capital for BIPOC organizations and communities, you also need to question, you need to be willing to question everything. So it's not just about creating a product and saying, we're going to create this product and that's our effort to make, you know, to become more equitable. It's every person, every decision, every process, like just start asking those questions.
Lisa?
I'll say, you know, it's great to create tools, and tools are important. Changing behavior and mindsets is even better. Use those tools that you've created to change the culture of how you think about lending, how business is developed, how you interact with funders, how you interact as an organization, and put racial equity at the forefront. That is really where the longer term change comes in, is if we are shifting how we behave as lenders in this industry. I will also do a second call to action to the funders out there. Fund this work. I know that the funding for racial equity, that the spirit is waning a bit, but this is still something that it requires the funding that we need to move this work forward. And that funding is needed not just for capital to deploy, but also for operations, because this work takes time. It's not something we can just do extracurricularly. So Yeah, thank you.
Yes, wholeheartedly. All right. Well, thank you all. And so I think one of the questions actually that has come up is how you get started. So I think we can roll this into one of the questions that we had wanted to talk about, which was, what were your lessons learned, right? All of you have been doing this work for about 4 to 5 years at this point, right? So as you're kind of for the people who are just getting started or are thinking about get started and where do we start, right? Your call to action start, where do we start? What are your lessons learned? And as you kind of talk about that, I'll pull some of the other questions that are coming through too. And then I guess whoever wants to get started with that, jump in. Dan? Yeah,
I'll go first. I mean, I think that what helped us as an organization, and I saw a question around leadership and who at the organization owns this, and it really has to start at the top. There's a commitment to equity, not by BIPOC individuals, including BIPOC individuals, but our leadership is not, not majority BIPOC, and that is a process that we're going through as an organization to really understand, how that commitment works, and you have to start and make that commitment before you can do the work, and it has to come from the leadership level. I also think that getting help from outside organizations who are experts when you're not an expert has been really helpful. There are consultants who are doing this work, and so we've found it really helpful to have folks help us doing surveys, doing the document review, getting to have some sense of where do we begin, from professionals who can advise has been also very helpful.
So I'll jump in. So at PCV, we not only have a board of directors, and it's now majority minority. So that's and they've been great supporters of the work that we do. We also have a advisory council, and that's made up of community members, various different types, including borrowers. So that advisory council to the leadership team and to the board, fantastic to have those voices being heard. And then we've learned the importance of connecting with local community partners to build trust, to understand local needs, and then to actually deliver on what they're asking for. So I think those are some key learnings.
One of the learnings I always think about is staffing the work. As Jen said, it is critically important that the buy-in come from the top of the organization. And once it makes its way to the folks who are going to actually do the work, staff the work. It's my role as Director of Racial Equity and Impact Lending was created out of the recognition that we can't have a loan officer working half-time to develop an impact scorecard. This really needs to be something that is really a key part of the organization's operations. And also kind of that other staffing piece, which is harder to really get our arms around and we're grappling with right now, is how to really make the time for this in lenders' work. It's sort of okay, here's this new thing you're going to do. How does that fit in? How do they rationalize that with all the other priorities on their desk? And how do we provide the support, both from a kind of capacity, actual literal time and resources capacity, and then also from, their capacity as lenders out there shifting from being, maybe in more of a sales mode to more of a, I'm here to talk about racial equity with you borrower mode, and creating the conditions where folks can feel comfortable having those conversations in a lot of different scenarios.
Yes, thank you all. And so I guess kind of going down this road of leadership and staff and how you find the time and all of this stuff. One of the questions that came through is how do you successfully operationalize this framework into performance goals and incentivize behavior change with your staff, especially tenured staff who might have a specific way of wanting to do stuff or a credit box that they have in mind?
Yeah, I can jump in. So at PCV, every associate, including the CEO, we have a personal development plan. So it's basically our performance goals. And within the lending team, one of those items is specific KPIs. So we have specific KPIs on LMI, on entrepreneurs of color, on women, percentages, dollar deployment, etc. So it's front and center. We have a live dashboard that as soon as loans are approved and are funded, the dashboard is automatically updated. So it's transparent across the organization. Even if you're not a lending team, you can see how the lending team is performing. So KPIs are there, we're accountable, and it's a transparent system for the entire organization.
Wow, live dashboard. Would love to see that. That's impressive. At LIF, we are moving. We're moving in the direction of thinking, how do we shift incentives and goals for lending staff and staff across the board that shift away from that kind of traditional dollar volume goals for lenders, which those goals don't say anything about the quality of every dollar that gets out. And so as we implement the IRP, we're thinking about how do we tie those goals to IRP milestones. So I'm just making this up, but something like, you need to, the weighted average impact score of the portfolio in this region needs to be 15 out of 23. And so that helps then the market director find those opportunities that are going to come in and bring that impact score up, and that then translates to how folks are doing their business. So that's something we're looking towards implementing in the next year or two as we start the process.
Yeah, and at CSH, particularly around the race initiative, we have these 5-year goals, and year one we had these goals as a team, and we just set the goals, and we lent, we did all the daily efforts to increase our outreach and connection to BIPOC organizations and really trying to meet the needs that we were hearing. This year in 2023, we extrapolated those team goals down to each individual community investment officer so that everyone has a tangible target to reach in terms of number of loans to both emerging and experienced BIPOC developers, and also a dollar target goal. So much is out of our hands in terms of the market and the need, but having those established to be able to measure and hold ourselves accountable at the team level and at the individual level, to be able to make tweaks and offer support and kind of problem solve and figure that out market by market is, I think, going to be really helpful.
Thank you all for sharing. And so we've talked about kind of like team member and staff and kind of executive leadership accountability, right? But the other side of the equation is like board accountability. Like, how do you kind of like move your boards along, or other stakeholders? Like, so you made that call to action to investors, right? So how do you go about changing hearts and minds of like the other side of the equation, right? Like the board members, the investors, other people with power in your network. And this, like the toolkit talks about this, right? When you do a power analysis, who has power, where is the power, kind of how does that impact you?
At PCV, I'm blessed with a board that I don't have issues with in terms of the work that we're doing. If anything, they push for better and greater results. So last year we deployed $10 million, and one of the board members said, "How can we get to 50 million?" Our demographics, our KPIs, how can we improve those KPIs? So I'm not having issues with them not being on board with the work that we're doing, but they're trying to add value and see how we can actually improve upon the work that we're doing, and that's a blessing for me and for the program.
Yeah, and it's gonna be more general too, right? Just like with anyone who like you've had like face resistance with, how do you kind of like move them along? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'll say at LIF for the board has adopted a resolution around racial equity, social justice and racial equity, and that's something that is front and center in how they conduct their leadership of the organization. And we're working really hard to bring them as close to the process as possible, so they see, as much from the lender perspective how these decisions are being made and the tools are being implemented. With funders, we'd love to sit down with funders and walk them through how this all works, where the origin of how we've created these tools, how we've created these products, what we're hearing from our customers, because as much as we are intermediaries at CDFIs, and we're we're in between the funders and the developers, the folks on the ground. The funders really rely on us to show and demonstrate, here's what we're seeing, this is where the capital is needed. And so, taking those opportunities to showcase what you see with your borrowers is really important.
Yeah, I mean, both what Bob and Elisa said with the, it's hard to deny the history of systemic racism in this country, and centuries of systemic racism against Black and Brown folks in this country, and the impact on wealth creation that has had, the impact on how we've built up our financing systems, who has built up our financing systems, why we've built up our financing systems, and where capital flows and has flowed as a result. I would like to say that would be enough for funders to just understand that we need to really make a shift and that they should be funding this work, because we are all implicit. We're all implicated in this power dynamic, and we need to really make a wholesale shift, particularly if we're saying that we are striving to be anti-racist organizations. What does it take to be an anti-racist organization? It means shifting power, shifting more money to Black and Brown folks across the country. And hopefully if we keep, pounding that message and conveying the impact that we're having as we take these steps forward for our borrowers and our communities, that will just continue to resonate.
I appreciate all of your being transparency and the honesty. This is hard work, and kind of being so open and honest about it, I think is part of becoming an anti-racist organization, right? But it also takes a lot of courage to kind of be able to say this in front of 600 people on a webinar, right? So I really appreciate how honest and transparent everyone's being. And I think along with that, I will say in the toolkit, we kind of note some of the resources and tools, right? And I think for all organizations, you have your board members and people who are stakeholders make explicit commitments to the work that you're doing. And so you can find those templates and stuff in the toolkit for those who are asking questions and looking for those resources. I know that we're quickly winding down. Bob, did you want to add something here, or?
The work is powerful, and it doesn't have to affect your portfolio. We had a 0.42, so less than 0.5% charge-off rate last year. We've been averaging less than 1. I was in front of a underwriting team at a major bank a few weeks ago. I was there to try to raise money for capital. They asked me, as I was explaining the work that we do and how we underwrite, they said, "What is your charge-off rate?" I asked them what they thought it might be. They thought it might be 7 to 9%. They just didn't understand that the underwriting that we do can still be impactful, but yet still provide a good, safe portfolio. So we haven't experienced any portfolio performance issues based on the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to actual versus perceived risk, right?
Yes.
It's a lot of what people think about is it's all perceived, but it's not actual. And the work you all done has gotten to the actual risk.
So much.
All right. I know the one last question, because it came up a couple of times. Jen, people want to know if you'd be willing to share some of the 77 recommendations, anything specific, or anything, or where they landed. And then I'll give you a moment to say that, and then we'll kind of close it out.
Yeah, I mean, the recommendations range from being more transparent on your website around putting your application on the website. There's a lot of the recommendations address transparency to borrowers about the process and how we evaluate our borrowers. And those are all really great points, ranging to, considering different loan approval and risk assessment processes and the power dynamics of one decision maker in our credit process versus a more inclusive process in any of our decisions in terms of our credit policies.
Thank you. And Leanne, if you can bring up the last slide as we close out. So again, thank you all, like Elisa, Jen, Bob, for like sharing your experiences and your expertise and your transparency, and for joining us, and to all of you for joining us today. So if you found today's discussion to be valuable, we encourage you to continue the conversation on CDFI Connect. And we hope we'll see many of you in person throughout the year at our upcoming events and trainings. Our Southwest Regional meeting is at the end of this month. Registration's open. We hope you'll save the date for the next Connect Plus webinar, which is going to be focused on CECL implementation. It features an overview of our new financial management tools and resources for CECL, and that'll be on Wednesday, May 31st. And then there's other events like our Small Business Finance Forum in Chicago in June. And last but not least, you can submit your session proposals for our 2023 OFN conference. So if you're interested in sharing the work that your organization's doing, please submit a session proposal. And again, thank you all for joining us today. We had a great conversation, and we hope that you got some value and learned something new today. All right. Thanks, everyone.